prior to that, I was at Parsons.
Yeah, and I'm Ray
Yeah.
Elsie. I'm professor at assistant professor at City University of Hong Kong.
Okay, so this paper really explores online strategies for generating design narratives that embrace the specific uncertainties that stem from online learning settings, specifically for upper level undergraduate and graduate design studio experience. And we hypothesized that based on our evidence-based teaching, that such strategies would be particularly suitable for designing material artifacts and embodied interactions. And ideas generated through these narratives can then be used to propel students' making in a research through making process. So the design studio experience is sort of integral to design education, and in contrast to other elements of design education, the studio experience is very hands-on, giving students the opportunity to acquire physical making skills in relation to the development of their own creative process. And therefore, it's a highly individualized experience for each student. And research through design is, again, integral to this process at all levels of study. The act of designing and making requires the designer to face several confrontations between competing or conflicting background knowledge, between theory and technology, and between dream and reality. And making provokes a particular cognitive activity, one which can be used to make people aware of tacit values and latent needs. And in research through design, the process of designing prototypes it in itself becomes a potential generator of knowledge, as the designer reflects on the different iterations of their work and reevaluates their purpose and context. But the studio experience, where such research through making occurs, heavily relies on physical making, obviously, active feedback from peers and mentors, and reflection and reevaluation. But there are difficulties associated with all three when teaching this process in an online setting. So we gathered the following insights from the literature review and also feedback from our students over the course of the past year and a half, when we both taught several online courses focused on design and making. So with physical prototypes, they need some form of digitization to be shared online. Feedback needs to be detailed and holistic, addressing flaws in both technical implementation and also contextualization of the work. In online studio learning context, researchers have found that misunderstandings about how something was made often happen, and that is basically the result of not being able to, investigate something up close, perhaps because of, limitation with project documentation. And then this can lead to irrelevant feedback or criticism heavily biased towards conceptual perfection, where such perfection is impossible to achieve with the current project-specific technical limitations. Reflection on the making-led research project is something that happens both in solitude and in social settings, where conversations and projects unfolding around the designer impact their way of thought, informing and inspiring their work. The studio environment, the physical studio environment that typically fosters this kind of experience, is difficult to recreate in an online learning context. So as we know, the pandemic has accelerated the development of both synchronous and asynchronous learning materials that can be taught online or in blended learning modes. And clearly there are advantages and disadvantages to both modes of learning. But the clear winner appears to be blended learning, where online educational materials and opportunities for interaction online are combined with traditional classroom methods with some degree of control over, time, place, path, and or pace by the students themselves. So then how do we go about designing a blended studio experience that embraces the advantages, or let's say opportunities, presented by online learning? And so firstly, we determined that the class needs to be a hybrid design studio, and assume that students will have some access to makerspace or workshop facilities. And then we did a SWOT analysis from the student experience perspective on the application and effectiveness of remote learning technologies when teaching design studio courses remotely. So these were the courses that we drew from the course evaluation comments left by students. Anyway, would you like to go through these?
Yeah, so one of the things we really wanted to look at initially is to look at some of the different strategies that we were using in our online teaching. As this conference is currently conducted in Zoom, I will have to say that my own research actually shows that like Zoom does a lot of things not well. I'll refer you to further papers on this area, um, but basically not very holistic. You don't get much interaction, very little information, etc. Now there are some other stuff out there. For example, there's things like Gather That Town, which is kind of the complete opposite of Zoom, actually, right? So you get to be a little bit interactive. It's like a game. There's a lot of play type of interactions, but you're not also not so much focused on the task, which is something that you often need to do. There's also things like Mozilla Hubs, which is technologically what sometimes a bit of a problem with students because they might be hard for them without VR headset, etc. But it is more holistic and more reflective for students. And then finally, something that I find really interesting is a platform called Oye, which kind of combines the Gather and Zoom, sort of in the middle grounds, not so much combining, but the middle ground between those two. And they can be reflective of time. You get to customize your background. You can put yourself in different places, so you're more freer to explore in the Zoom, but still somewhat focused to the task. So there's also a lot of collaboration platforms. Some of these are useful, I think, especially for us for the ideation phases. So I'm sure you know a lot of these things. There's also ones that are a little bit more focused on when you're actually doing the design, like for example Figma, which is very recommended because it's collaborative and designing together. Um, and what we get with these things uh, at the end is actually an ability to think about now what we want to do when we're doing the fabrication aspect of it. I think that's the key component here.
Yeah, so there's several strengths that can be easily sort of highlighted when it comes to blended online learning. And these student comments highlight some of the aspects that we think are integral to teaching an online design studio. So a designated channel for seeking out technical support is very important, given that students don't have access to the technicians who would normally be supporting their making in physical workshop environment. Asynchronous learning, of course, affords a lot of flexibility in how students can schedule their days, but also the synchronous components are essential for the simultaneous experience of, group engagement, group learning, community building, socializing in general, and so on. And then moving on to the key weaknesses, an important insight we acquired was that students had differing opinions about what was the best way to use synchronous class time. So some preferred to spend more time with their classmates and socialize and use it as an opportunity to build community, while others prefer to spend the time doing more one-on-one meetings with their professors. So there's a conflict between individualized learning experience and group learning. And of course, another major challenge is unequal access to the educational technology used for the course, or general access to things like the internet or availability of electricity. And then the opportunities, most importantly, that we identified include the purposeful incorporation and mix of technologies to motivate students and keep them motivated, the opportunity to create a database of learning materials and resources that can be shared and improved for future users, potentially contributing to better availability of open source learning materials in the future. And then embracing the strengths and limitations of hybrid learning to propel students to think more creatively about the subject matter. So the subject matter of the topic explored in the course and the technologies used to conduct the course all kind of work together. And this last point calls for deliberate incorporation of those types of technologies and platforms that connect with the learning material in meaningful ways, so that they become a much more natural part of the learning experience, as opposed to something that students feel forced to deal with, just to complete their homework. And the main threats that we need to be aware of are, as we design a course that purposefully incorporates online learning tools so that we can create more meaningful interactions with them, include obviously avoiding unnecessary cognitive overload when using multiple technologies or platforms, students feeling left out or losing interest when there's lack of individualized attention given to them, or while navigating this complex set of systems that they have to navigate through, and reinforcing the digital divide, which is something we definitely don't want to do. And the last one of these, I think we can sort of tackle it by carefully considering what platforms are accessible by all students, while the first two we think could be addressed by embracing the uncertain nature of online learning in creative ways that connects with the learning material, which in our case involves design narratives.
So in consideration of this, so we thought really long and hard about what we can design as a new course based on some of these findings. So I think one of the insights that we thought of is that actually usually uncertainty is thought of as a very negative thing. For example, you don't know whether the economy is going to go to shit, et cetera, et cetera, and what's going on during coronavirus, et cetera, et cetera. But we thought of actually uncertainty as actually a really cool, interesting something that we crave, right? Like, so for example, if you write a book, you want to have uncertainty in your book, right? Because like the novel is exciting and you don't know what's going to happen, etc., etc. So basically, we thought of uncertainty less as sort of these things that we have to fix, as opposed to things that we actually can crave. And so the question is, can you actually bring this type of excitement and positive influence into the teaching process, basically. So what we thought of is that perhaps we can come up with some narrative strategies for people to actually start thinking about in that way. So we thought of them as narrative prompts, story prompts. So for example, these are some of the prompts that we thought of. So a prompt would be like giving without receiving. So they would have to start with a story before designing or making anything. And so this prompt is actually what leads them to write a story about this particular theme, basically, right? So what are they using here? They have to use uncertainty in a positive way, right? Now, with that story written, then they start thinking about what they're going to build based on this idea. And the idea is to kind of allow them to think about uncertainty, right, in a positive term. And therefore, when they're doing the making, they're realizing that all the questions that they've been having because they can't talk to each other in a full way. Well, those are actually things that will help them in some sense, right? It's kind of like where if you keep failing, it's kind of like a positive, right? If you just keep failing over and over. So that was sort of the idea. So here's some more prompts. Imagining without seeing. That's another one that potentially they can use virtual reality and things like that to solve. Trusting without knowing. Another really interesting story prompt. So anyway, so these are some of the prompts that we thought of and we wanted to incorporate into our class. But unfortunately, this class was not able to completely be realized, so we're kind of working on like a future version of this course due to like the logistics and school, stuff. So, Bola, do you want to take this one? Yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of the the actual topic or the content of the course, the idea was to focus on remote presence and bodily interactions. We asked ourselves, for a hybrid blended design studio experience, that also engages in research through making, what's appropriate. And since research through making is focused on embodied knowledge, and the students are already interacting with each other remotely, the topic of remote presence and embodied bodily interaction seemed like a good choice. And so, in other words, this is new remote presence strategies that extend our bodies across time, space, and culture. Culture, because this course is a collaboration between two universities based in Hong Kong and New York. And the course would provide a paradigm for students from diverse backgrounds facing different political situations and to assess each other's current contexts and discuss issues related to each other's home countries, personal experiences, and so on. So in the process, students would ideally be engaging in personal and collective meaning making that will inspire their design of embodied bodily interactions across time, space, and culture.
Um,
Um,
so, so finally, we just wanted to give some couple of examples based on the previous work, right? So this is the, so I just wanted to, uh, you know, tell you about, for example, this work, which was basically remotely fabricated. So we don't have access to them when they're actually making it. In fact, when they actually brought it in, like the last day to actually show it, I was like very, super happily surprised. But basically, this is basically a robotic mouse designed for pets. So the idea is that this mouse, this robot would, for example, avoid obstacles. It would have this like tail laser that the cat would chase after, etc. Obviously, I don't have the cat as well, so they're all doing this individually on their own, and in fact, they're separated too as a team. So they had to kind of deliver this machine one person to the next kind of strategy. Um, but I was super, so we're like just super happy with the result because it got presented at the ACM conference, etc., etc. So, um, so definitely there are situations where even this remote making process can still work out really well.
and now on the other side of the spectrum, this is from a course focused on fashion visibility and sort of wearables. And a student of mine wanted to create a sort of a building, a common ground, a sort of common framework of inclusive and adaptive fashion, and kind of address that through a pair of pants that can be used by all body types. So, regardless of whether the user is in a wheelchair or not in a wheelchair. And the problem, obviously they had with this is that they do not have access to someone who is on a wheelchair, so they could not test it with, some of their users, and you know, hence, this is sort of this one of the difficulties, I think, with online sort of fabrication focused studios, that you are not always going to have access to the users or the tools and materials you require. But I think there could be interesting strategies that, perhaps go with these three themes: giving without receiving, imagining without seeing, trusting without knowing. That could be sort of creatively used to explore remote presence strategies. And we'd love your ideas on how this could be further developed. So, as Ray mentioned before, due to some, logistical, like policy specific, really new school policy specific changes, this could not run this fall. But, we're hoping to develop it more and, run it in the near future. And thank you to some folks who supported the work on the way.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'd love to get your ideas actually on, so we kind of gave, um, some insights from our previous teaching, took out the main elements, and then Bullard walked us through the SWOT analysis to really, understand what the students are feeling a little bit more. But the second part where we're actually designing a class, that requires having the class actually run, right? So we'd love to have some ideas about the kind of things that you think would work really well for this research through making approach specifically in an online strategy.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you both, Laura and Ray. Great prompts for us to reflect through. Perhaps before we dive into those, I'd love to ask one clarifying question, perhaps, about your assessment methodology. When you said that the winner is blended learning, wondering how you ended up in that, making that choice. It was early in your
Yeah. So going back to this one, so there were clear sort of advantages with synchronous learning. You can have people come together all in the same room or in a Zoom setting at the same time, and there's real-time feedback, and you can kind of communicate without using verbals, non-verbals. So there's behavioral learning happening, but then the asynchronous aspects are also students have commented that, for example, having a Slack channel where they can get tech support was really helpful. And they did not need to be in the classroom with everybody else to be kind of like, lining up to see the professor to get, support on those things. The unstructured aspect of that allowed students to, schedule their, afforded them more flexibility in terms of scheduling and so on. And so giving some students back the student, some control back to the students, so that they can take ownership of their learning and be guided at the same time through that process through the synchronous sort of components. So that's how it kind of came to the conclusion that, well, blended then is kind of the ideal approach.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
So it's open. Oh, go ahead.
Just a quick thing. Also, like looking at the literature that we found, the positives and negatives of each one, and then as you can see listed here, there are some really clear advantages of either. So I think that's the short answer.
Okay, great. Yeah, we have 6 minutes for questions, comments, reactions to the 3 prompts. I took the liberty to put them in the chat so that maybe you can stop the screen share and we can share the Zoom space together.
So Ray, do you want to also share your sort of elaboration on sort of trusting without knowing, how that would materialize as sort of remote learning strategy?
Yeah, I think what we were thinking of doing with that, because it's a collaborative thing where folks from New York and folks from Hong Kong will work together, is to basically actually have a collaborative writing strategy where you have team members which are on both sides of the Pacific or whatever ocean we're separated by, and then they would have a certain amount of time to kind of write their section of the story. And the reason we want to do that is because it's kind of uncertain, that it creates uncertainty as well. But the uncertainty could be fun because they might not know what the other side is writing. So you kind of have to trust the other side to go the direction of the story that you want to as well, given the common purpose that they're going towards. So they're kind of like trying to finish each other's stories basically. So they're limited by that. But I think the difficult part for us is to like now take that strategy and ask like, how do we translate to the making part? Because we don't have that class done, right? Like we don't have that class to actually prototype with. But ideally, we would actually take that and actually allow them to construct a project around that prompt, basically, so that whatever they're building, it would be kind of in relation to that prompt as well.
Thank you. Peter.
I was wondering, and I think actually because Cynthia put it into the chat and they're all listed on top of each other, I noticed that all of them are based on this, like, let's say, opposition, giving without receiving, imagining without seeing. So there's always, but the opposition is always created with this preposition without. So it seems without kind of implies something is missing or something is not there. Had you ever imagined to vary that and not just, because that suggests sort of uncertainty is something without something.
Right.
But it could be too much of something or something like that. So I'm wondering, is there any conceptual logic why you always use without and imply this sort of missing lack of something? But that's a maybe very detailed question. I'm not sure, but I just stumbled across it.
Yeah, Peter, that's probably a really deep question, right? Because that's kind of the human like that's canonical way to describe uncertainty is that there's some missing information, right? But you're right that it may not be like that. It could be a mistaken perception, that might not have anything to do with without something. It might be that you have too much of a something, and then your interpretation is incorrect because you think from this very biased point of view. Yeah, yeah, that's totally. Yeah, that we could create more prompts.
Well, but even in, while I was asking the question, I was thinking along the same example that you just used. If I have too much, then you could actually saying you could still phrase it as a without kind of relation, like with sort of trusting without knowing the exact or amount of. So you can still. But anyway, yeah, I'm trying to get my. Is uncertainty really about lacking something? Is uncertainty, is that really the conundrum? I have never thought about that. I'm
Well,
not sure.
I think the prompts here are like they're kind of designed to be not just uncertainty, but kind of a way to write the story a little bit, in some
Mm.
sense, right? Like imagining without seeing. Basically, we thought of that as kind of like, well, it's kind of this immersive experience where what if you just can't see, right? Like you are using your other senses, etc., right? So the uncertainty is basically you losing your most prominent, for a lot of people, their most prominent sense. How would you, if you're constrained by that, what would you do?
Mm.
That type of idea. So the idea is actually, the idea is actually constrain the students so that they're forced to make this kind of choice based on uncertainty, but then to actually use that to allow them to build the very thing that they're going after. Um, Unfortunately, we don't have something solid where they're actually making that, right? So if the course were to happen, and maybe we can happen in the future as well, then we would be able to address these questions a little bit more.
And then just a detailed question, and I don't mean to be petty, it's just really out of interest. You mentioned in the slideshow, and there was actually a slide Hong Kong, New York, but my understanding was that Bolo has actually moved to another university. So will this still be with Hong Kong and New York, or will it actually now be with the other university? And how may that affect the whole collaboration?
Yeah, so I'm currently based in Boston, so potentially Boston and Hong Kong.
And will that have an impact in terms of, for example, I have New York and I have never been to Boston, but New York and Hong Kong are both very high-rise dominated. I believe Boston maybe less so, but I'm not sure it is.
Yes, potentially. I think, yeah, the location, just the characteristics of the place, the history, the culture, I think all of that, we're hoping would play into what students make and how they interact with each other, how they create that sort of meaning. It's a meaning making, a collective and personal meaning making process for them.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Polar and Ray. A lot to reflect on. Thank you for this contribution. And